Again, I'm Amy Baldwin with Otter County, and here with us today is Jason Aarsvold from Ehlers Public Finance. And they're one of our partners that we use, as I talked about earlier, when we're looking at these projects, you know, how can they be structured? How should they be structured? What's the future tax revenue that we might be able to leverage into making a project financially happen? And helps us review and analyze those projects. And so we're going to talk about financing structures and how you can use those to make housing happen. And I'll let Jason introduce himself and we'll go from there.
Sure. As Amy said, I'm Jason Aarsvold with Ehlers. So we're a public finance firm. We do a lot of economic development work, a lot of housing work. The other side of our business is we do a lot of advising for cities on financial related matters, issuance of bonds, long-term financial planning, things of that nature. But my history is that Amy and I go back a long ways. We used to work together in the city of Brooklyn Park. And so I spent a lot of my career working for public entities, and now for the last about 9 years working for Ehlers. And so along the way, we've had an opportunity to see a lot of different kinds of projects like the ones that you all are talking about, particularly housing. And so what we wanted to talk about today was just, you know, why might a public entity need to participate in these housing projects? That's one piece of this that's, I think, important to talk about, and how are we deploying and protecting public resources when we do that. I'll talk a little bit about public financing tools. Amy asked me to talk specifically about tax increment financing and tax abatement. Those are the tools that are most commonly deployed to get housing built in our communities in Minnesota, along with these other things that I know Amy has talked about, as well as resources from other governmental entities as well. We'll talk a little bit about that. And then at the end, I think, which is probably the more interesting part of the discussion, is that there are some examples of how these financing sources have been deployed into housing projects, both in the county here and throughout the rest of the state. Okay, oops, sorry. So starting off, as I mentioned, with why would you want to consider providing financial assistance, or why might it be necessary? And I don't think this probably is going to come as a surprise to anybody, but you know, fundamentally, there's a financial barrier preventing the private market from developing a site in accordance with the city or county's vision. We generally refer to that there's a financial gap in the project, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But why might there be a gap? And again, these are the things that, you know, aren't a surprise to any of us, but we deal with a lot of sites that have, you know, existing buildings or contamination, and those costs can't be borne, and also then build a project on top of that. You know, high project costs, this is the thing we're all dealing with right now. You know, we've seen prices for all kinds of things escalate dramatically, you know, and they're outpacing the revenues that we generally can get from rents and sales. And so that creates a problem. We see a lot of times market rents and sales prices aren't high enough to support the costs that it takes to build some of these projects, right? So if you want to build an apartment building and you can only get, you know, so much in rent, and it's not enough to pay for all those costs of construction and a return on investment, well then you're not going to build it. And so that's an opportunity for the city to participate. Sometimes there are cheaper alternatives elsewhere, so developers will move on to areas where it's easier to develop, easier to make a buck. And then sometimes, you know, cities' visions might be incompatible with the market. So sometimes cities might want to see a particular use happen or a particular kind of housing happen, and the market simply can't deliver it. You know, one simple example of that is affordable housing. We work with a lot of communities that want to provide affordable housing, and the market, you know, when you say we want the rents restricted at certain levels, can't build that all by itself because those rents aren't high enough to support the cost of construction. So that creates an opportunity for city participation, and that's why you might provide assistance.
I'm going to plug in one thing on that slide, Jason, that we see from a county perspective, and that we have different markets even within the county, and we want to help support all of our communities, but that the same project is going to look different in one community versus another, just based on the dynamics and some of those pieces that Jason talked about. So, you know, and I just had a conversation, I don't see her in here, but about one community where, you know, it's a different market. They have different challenges, different opportunities, but it's also why there might need to be that role of financial assistance or participation differently than in other communities.
Yeah, and so what does that look like? I mean, just very simply, right, if you have a project and you start weighing what is it going to cost me to get this whole thing built, and then you start looking at, well, what are the sources that I have to pay for that? And you say, well, the bank will give me X number of dollars, I'll bring so much equity to the project, you know, there's other cash sources potentially there, and if those aren't enough to pay for all those costs, it's not going to get built. And kind of on the flip side of this, you know, if you start looking at your project and let's say you have enough to get it potentially built, but then you start looking at it and let's say it's, you know, affordable housing, for example, or something like that, and you start looking at, well, what's going to cost to operate this project, and at the end of the day, do I have enough revenue coming in to pay for all those operating expenses? And if you don't, that also creates a financial gap, and we'll have examples of what both of those look like. So I'm going to jump into tax increment financing and tax abatement here. I'm not going to go too far into the weeds on this. We spend hours, you know, in sessions talking about this. This is going to be very high level. So, you know, hopefully it doesn't, you know, your eyes don't glaze over. But there are a whole bunch of tools that cities, counties can deploy out there to help with housing. This is not an exhaustive list by any means, but these are kind of the big buckets that are out there. There's tax levy dollars that cities can use, counties can use. They can use those to make revolving loan funds. I've circled tax increment financing and tax abatement because those are the two that I'm going to focus on here. And then there's all kinds of state, local resources, the kinds that, you know, Amy's talked about with their rollout of their programs are great examples of that. You know, again, the counties, states, all have resources that they can potentially bring to help get housing built. And I think, you know, when you look at this list, I think, you know, we talked about this a little bit, Otter County is using pretty much all of those things, right? So you're really leveraging all that you can, I think, in the county right now, in addition to these new programs to help get things constructed. So I'm just going to, the basic concept of tax increment financing for those that don't know anything about it, and that's in this, the next two slides are just the kind of the key to all of it. It's a very simple concept, and there's just a lot of complexity to it, but it's this idea that you can build something new and capture most of the increased local property taxes from that development within a defined geographic area for a defined period of time without the approval of other taxing jurisdictions, right? So cities and counties can create these districts, capture the new taxes from development, and use those and direct those towards the covering costs of the project to help make it fill that gap that I talked about. So that's just the fundamental basics of what it's about. And when you're capturing taxes, you're capturing the city's portion of the tax, the county's portion of the tax, school district portion of the tax, and then any other small taxing jurisdictions that are a part of that area where you're building. And the last part there is, you know, the cities and counties, you can create those districts without approval of all those other jurisdictions. That's kind of one of the key things about tax increment to understand. And this is more of a graphical representation of what that looks like. So, you know, you have on the left side there, you have an existing property that's the blue value. It's just called, that's the value that's there today. The line there is where the creation line is where you create a new district. Then that purple area is the area where the taxes and value grow in that district and over time. And that is the portion of that tax bill that you're capturing. That's the increment. And then when the district is done, the bar in the green, the idea is that you've built up an area in the city that now has a bigger tax base, and that's available back to all the taxing jurisdictions. So you've helped that project get built when it otherwise wouldn't have, and instead of having the value in the city or county on the left there, the base value, you now have all the value that's in green. So that's fundamentally the reason why you do it, and then that area in purple is what gets diverted to help the project get constructed. So that's just kind of the basic concept. So before I move ahead, does anybody, I want to make sure that's kind of the key piece of this. Everybody good on that? All right.
What's the typical time?
I'll talk about that. So it's a good segue into this slide. So you can't just create a tax increment district anywhere you want, right? You have to have a reason to do it, and the state statutes tell you that there are certain ways that you can qualify to create a tax increment district. And these are organized by like the type of activity. So if you're trying to do redevelopment of a site, right? So you've got existing buildings, it's already built up, and maybe they need to be removed because they're, you know, dilapidated or whatever. You can create what's called a redevelopment district, and there's a test to create that. It has to do with making sure you got enough area that's covered and that enough of the buildings are substandard. And if you can qualify, then you can keep that district open for 26 years. So that's the longest duration for a tax increment district is 26 years. If you don't have as many buildings that are substandard but there are still some that are substandard, then you can create what's called a Renewal and Renovation District. And that is intended to accomplish the same thing, but that has a shorter duration. It's a 16-year maximum duration. The idea there being that your redevelopment challenge isn't quite as acute or bad, and so you don't need as many years to remedy that condition. That's, I think, kind of the logic. The other bucket is affordable housing, and so you can also create a tax increment district for qualified housing. And I will go into detail about this one since we're focusing on housing in another slide here. That one, when you create it, it's a 26-year maximum duration. So, just know that that's also one of the longest ones. The idea there being, we all know it's really challenging to try and create affordable housing. You need the time to be able to raise the funds to be able to actually, get affordable housing built. So that's why that one is longer. If you're just looking at sort of a job creation and tax base efforts where you've got like a greenfield site, there's nothing there. There is an option for that, and that's called an Economic Development District, and that's limited to 9 years. And that really only works for manufacturing, warehouse distribution, research and development. There's a telemarketing is a thing in the statute. I don't even know if those places exist anymore. I'm sure they must somehow. And then space necessary and related to those. So you could have an office that is related to the manufacturing plant, and that's all eligible to be in one of these districts. And if that use is in that district, then it's eligible to be in there for a 9-year maximum duration. One other piece that has been added more recently to that section of the statute is that it'll allow you to create an economic development district to construct workforce housing. And there are some requirements that you need to meet in order to be able to create one of those, but if you do that, you can create an economic development district for housing, but it's still limited to 9 years, and then you don't really have any income or rent restrictions, which you would have that come along with a regular housing district. And the idea there being that a lot of places, like areas in the county here, need housing, and they need it for the workforce, and those workers are getting paid a wage that's a good wage. So it doesn't necessarily need to be income restricted housing, but it needs to be housing that those workers can afford to pay for it. So you want to add something, Amy?
Yeah, I'm just going back to the top line, the redevelopment district, and that's, you heard from Battle Lake earlier today in the Hatchery Row project, and we showed pictures of what that site looked like before demolition. It is a cleared site now, but that's the city established what Jason just talked about for a redevelopment district. So there's housing within that project, but it really falls under that redevelopment category. So it's creating that new tax base to, and then as Val discussed, the new taxes that will come from that project are help offsetting those expenses that the city took to undertake that project. So just to give a little context to something that was talked about earlier and how it's being used, and there's many examples of that, but that was one we just heard this morning. So just to give that little bit of context to how our communities are using that, and there's many communities are using the housing TIF, which Jason will talk more about, and we can use some of those examples too if there's questions.
It's a great point. I mean, there's so much nuance to all of this, but once you create a redevelopment or renewal and renovation district and meet that test, you can put whatever you want in there. You can put retail in there if you want to. You can put housing in there. It doesn't have to be income restricted housing. It could be market rate housing. With these other ones, with the affordable housing district, you have to meet income tests, which I'll talk about. Economic development has to be one of those uses that I mentioned. It can't be another use, it can't be retail. So there are some nuances about how those work, but with redevelopment, renewal, and renovation, you have a lot more flexibility once you get those established. So housing TIF district, as I said, is 26 years. The main test to be able to create one of these is meeting certain income thresholds. And the TIF law just simply references the federal requirements that are applicable to tax credit housing. So what does that mean? It just, we'll talk about what that means, but as long as there are a lot of affordable housing in the state is built using federal tax credits, and there are requirements that go on, income and rent requirements that go along with those that also apply in a housing TIF district. That's all you need to know there. And then there's just, we talk about pooling sometimes, and this is kind of getting into the weeds, but once you create one of these, if you're not using all the increment for that particular project that's in that district, you can take whatever excess there might be and use it elsewhere in a city or county, just to know that. And you can do that in other types of districts, but there are a lot more heavy restrictions on being able to do that. And then you just need to be able to, you need to take any increment you get from there and spend it on the affordable housing. You can have commercial projects in the district, but you can't use any of the increment to help assist those projects. Okay, so just look ahead there. So we build rental, you can build rental housing or for sale owner occupied housing in a TIF district, housing TIF district. And so for rental, the requirements are that at least 40% of the units need to be income restricted to those at 60% of median income, or 20% of the units need to be restricted to those at 50% of the area median income. And that's an annual test. So every year, you'll have, if a developer were to enter into an agreement like this, there would be an annual submission of documentation that the tenants meet that income requirement. If they don't, the district can't legally exist anymore and would need to be shut down. The one thing to know about this is that the statute for tax increment, while it has an income test for each of these thresholds, it does not have a corresponding rent limit attached to it. And so theoretically, you wouldn't need to include that, but many cities and counties will include in their agreements both an income, which they have to by statute, and a rent limitation, which is typical for a lot of affordable housing that gets built. Just simply because there's a practical limitation to what folks at those income thresholds can actually pay for rent anyways. And so, and the idea being that you're building it for them to be able to afford that. So just briefly here, this is what the income limitations look like in Otter Tail County. So there's a lot of people are interested in 30% of median income. That's not one that's applicable necessarily to the TIF statute specifically, but it's in there just for illustration. So the 50 and 60% threshold, so if you're a family of 4, that 60% threshold is $44,700 annual income. And then that translates into a rent of $1,162 maximum rent amount that could be paid if you were to employ those rent restrictions along with it. So sometimes people, wonder, well, am I going to, we're going to be able to get enough rent to be able to do our project, or is it just going to make our numbers go backwards, right? Even though you're giving us money, are we going to be able to, make it work? And sometimes these rents that are allowed here are sometimes close to where the market's at anyways, and if that's the case, it really isn't going to send you backwards as far as doing this in a housing tax increment district. So for owner-occupied, it's a little different. So if you do a tax increment district in an owner-occupied subdivision, for example, which you can, then 95% of the first buyer's incomes are limited to either 100% of the area median income for a family of 2 or fewer, or 115% for a family of 3 or more. So now, you can see those numbers there in 2021. The new numbers are about to come out any day now, but they weren't available when I put this together. So the 2 or fewer is income of 93,100, and the 115% number, just over 107,000 annually. So it's the greater of the county or the state, and so you get a little more flexibility there. So this is using then the state median number, and so you have a little bigger threshold there. And so you can afford a reasonable house payment and house value with those incomes, and they may work for some of you looking at subdivisions.
Yeah, so I think this also ties back to what Elaine from Otter Tail talked about this morning in the land that the city purchased that had been platted into too small of lots. The city purchased it, has replatted it, took the initiative to put the infrastructure in from the road and water perspective, and they're using, again, the future taxes to offset that infrastructure expense that the city took on. So that's a new subdivision that is down the road, and she referenced there's and Amanda's here too. That selling the lots for $1, they're not looking to get their money back to pay for their expenses through the land sale. They're really looking at the future taxes on those new homes and are committed to making sure they're sold to folks, again, the first buyer, at least within that subdivision, to fall within those income limits for the project. And Fergus Falls just has set up a housing TIF district for an owner-occupied project. Folks are here involved in that project. Perham has for many years set up districts like this for a lot of their single family, and Battle Lake, a number of communities have used this tool. So just want to make sure that that's understood, that this is a pretty common tool that our cities are using, and to be thinking about how to offset those expenses associated with getting the project moving forward.
Excuse me. When we go back to the rent limits, is that the gross rent limits or is that just the rent?
It's generally the limitation that's published is generally the gross, so that would be, you need to back out a utility allowance.
Okay.
Yeah. Yep.
Thank you.
And Amy made a good point, or reiterated a good point that's in the slide, but this is just applicable in a housing district for sale housing to the first buyer, right? So you're not having to annually do this. Once the first buyer meets the test, you're done. That's the end of it. So just something to be aware of. So the process to create a district is not overly complicated, but there are some prescriptive steps that need to be followed. Some districts require that you just send a notification to the county commissioner in the affected area that there is a district that's going to be created. So that just has to be done 30 days before you publish a public hearing notice. And then you have to prepare a TIF plan document. So that just lays out all the details of the project, sets a budget, all the things that go along with that, and it's, a 20-page document that is the plan for the district. And that's what ultimately gets taken to the city or county for approval. That plan needs to get circulated to the county and to the city for review, or to the school district, for review. They can provide comment on it, but they don't have the ability to sort of veto the project. Like I said, they don't get to decide. It's the entity creating the district that will ultimately get to decide. Then once that's done, you need to publish notice that there will be a public hearing on the consideration of the tax increment plan. And then at that public hearing, the city or county will hold that public hearing and adopt the TIF plan. And once that's done, then it's really just administrative from there. There's really can be just one city meeting, county meeting for approval of these plans, but they're going to specify the type of district, the but-for test, which we'll talk about in a little more detail. You probably heard something about that. You're making findings that it conforms with the plans of the city, and that you're promoting your own economic development in the manner that you intended. So there's some findings and a resolution of approval. But once that's done, then it just gets sent to the county, and the county recognizes that that's a district and starts collecting the taxes within that district and sending them to the entity that made the TIF plan. So that's TIF kind of in a nutshell.
We are doing this session again this afternoon, so if you want to come back for a refresher, we'll be doing it again.
Raise your hands if you have questions. We can be casual about this too. So if you don't get it, let me know. Because go ahead.
Is TIF generally transferable? So like if someone builds a project and then wants to sell, can that new entity take the benefits of the TIF if it's only 5 years into the TIF timeline?
Yeah, the simple answer is yes, it can. Yep. So tax abatement, this is another form that gets used, and I know the county and Amy are using this now for different types of housing initiatives, but this is essentially like tax increment. We think about it in very much the same way, but you're capturing it's all or a portion of it. You can actually abate even that little base value in the TIF chart that I showed you. You can even abate that if you want to. It's not a good idea, but you can. And you can take those revenues, again, within a defined geographic area, but the difference is that you do need approval of all the other taxing jurisdictions, right? So it's like an opt-in, right? So if the city wants to do an abatement, they can choose to do that. They can go ask the county, are you willing to participate in the abatement? The county could say no, and then they don't. Or they could say yes, and then both tax streams will get abated. Same thing with the school district. We often think about when are we going to use abatement? It's a lot of times when you can't create a tax increment district, because you're generally not going to generate as much for as long a period of time with abatement as you might with tax increment. but there might also be a reason, remember I said you just can't create a TIF district anywhere, right? So let's say you can't create a redevelopment district and you need and you want to develop market rate housing. And we have an example of this in the presentation. You might decide to use tax abatement because it doesn't have those income restrictions attached to it and you don't have the option of using TIF. So that's one reason why, business retention we talked about. So you might have an existing business that doesn't necessarily plan any new expansion that's going to generate increment or, new value, but you might want to do something to keep them there. You theoretically can abate their existing taxes. Now, that doesn't happen very often because that's effectively a tax increase on everybody else in the jurisdiction. So that's why
We don't do that.
Yeah. I have to say it. You can do it. It doesn't happen very often. There's not a lot of options for office and retail development with TIF, again, unless you're in a redevelopment or renewal and renovation district. And so that's why sometimes abatement will get used in those circumstances as well. And again, here are the county housing abatement programs, right? So you've used it in ways that you couldn't, there wasn't other options necessarily or good options available, and abatement made the most sense. And so that's why it worked. So I talked about this a little bit. How does it work? Well, again, each jurisdiction has to agree to participate. And so if they do, then those taxes can be abated. And so if you have all three entities, city, county, school, then the statute says that you're limited to 15 years. That's the duration of time that you can be allowed to abate the taxes, 15 years. If it's only one or two entities, so if only the city or just the city and county go in on it, you can go up to a maximum of 20 years. And if you happen to pass an abatement resolution that doesn't specify how long that you want it to run, then it just defaults to 8 years. I've never seen that happen, but that's what the statute says. So again, talked about existing business, we won't talk about that anymore. So with both of these cases, whether it's TIF or abatement, you're generating an annual stream of revenue, right, in the future. So, you're going to collect increments and you're going to start getting them 2 years from now or a year and a half from now, and there's going to be so much every year for 26 years. Great. How does that help my project now, right? And there's a couple different, you need essentially is a financing mechanism to be able to do that. And so the most common and kind of the default way that this is done is through what we call a pay-as-you-go form of assistance. And so what that means is that, just the way it sounds, the city pays out the tax increment as you go along in the district. And how does that help a developer or an owner? Well, then it requires that they go out and talk with their banks or their equity partners or whoever it is. They have to bring that additional money up front now to be able to put into the project with the idea that it'll be paid back over time with TIF. So we see a lot of people going out and having their first mortgage increased, for example. So maybe they could only get $2 million, now they can get 2.5 because of this TIF commitment, and that helps close their gap, right? So that's one way that happens. Some folks will bring their own equity and just say, well, we'll finance the TIF part, and then we'll just pay ourselves back in the future with the tax increment. The advantage, there for the city is obvious, right? A lot of cities, first of all, don't have the funds up front to be able to provide. And second of all, even if they did, they're putting them at risk in a development project that, these don't always work out, right? So that's why it's appealing to cities, and the way that banks have operated, it hasn't been a problem for anybody really to be able to get these financed in a pay-as-you-go manner. The other way is upfront money coming from the city, right? And then relying on the increment to pay the city or county back. And this can be a couple different ways. It could be existing fund balance that they have. They could put it into the project and rely on the increment in the future to pay itself back. But again, many cities don't have that luxury. There are options to be able to issue debt, right? And so cities can issue general obligation bonds backed by the tax increment and rely on the tax increment to pay those bonds back. And the risks there are, I think obvious, right? The general obligation debt means that if the revenues aren't there from the TIF in the future, you pledged the city's full faith and credit to repay the bonds. So you're gonna have to raise taxes to pay the bonds or risk defaulting, which is not something that any city should do. So that there is a risk there. And so while many cities do this, I'm working on one right now where we're gonna put the bonds together to pay for infrastructure, but it's gonna be repaid by a big project, and that project is under construction. So there's a little more certainty when it comes down to that. So there's It's not as common, but just know that that is one way that that can occur. Does that make sense? How you get into a project. So the other side of this is, we've got all these resources out there. We want to make sure that we're not giving away too much of the resources. And so and the statute actually requires for TIF this test, but one of the things that you'll see, Amy doing with her projects, or anybody city that you might talk to, is that they're going to want to understand, why is there? You're telling us there's a gap in the project. Show us why with numbers, right? Your budget, your pro forma for the project, and then we're going to look at that, analyze it, and decide, we think there is, or there's a way we can structure it where it doesn't need to be as much, or your assumptions are off here. We think, we kind of go through that exercise to determine, is there really a gap, and what is it, right? And a lot of the work happens for me in the metro area, and there are a lot of sophisticated developers that know how to calculate their own tax increment. And if they want to do a housing district, the request that they tell us every time that they need 26 years. Magically they need all 26 years. And so, we kind of laugh a little bit, and then we kind of go, okay, well, here's what you're really going to need, And so that's just a, back and forth that we go through just to make sure that provide, policymakers, elected officials, community members with comfort that if you're going to be providing public resources for a project, you're only providing as much as is necessary to get it built. You're going to say something. Okay. And so when we do that, we're looking, okay, we don't maximize what private funding sources are out there. Is the mortgage high enough? Is there enough equity coming into this? We want to minimize the public assistance to the extent necessary. We're looking at what other resources are out there. So it's just a whole analysis and exercise that we go through to try and make sure we're only providing as much assistance as necessary. That whole exercise, we kind of generally, you hear referred to as the but-for test, right? So the idea is that the project wouldn't happen but for the assistance that's being provided. That is an actual finding that is required of the entity approving a tax increment district when they create a new district. They have to make a finding that lays out the reasons why this project wouldn't happen but for the tax increment. And that whole pro forma analysis exercise is what really can do that. And so again, it's really just looking at that. We're also looking at, how much value is likely to occur here? What if you subtract out the assistance that's being provided? What is that value now? And then you're saying that there's not other alternatives that are going to be creating value more than that. That's another way that you can look at it using that but-for test. But you just have to go through that exercise to create a district. And again, it's the elected body that makes the finding. Questions about that? Yeah.
There's some, say I'm a local government, whether at administrative level or elected official, is there some type of benchmark in terms of returns, whether it's for housing or what, in terms of how I'm trying to think about this but for? It's like, but for this, I wouldn't make 12%. Yep. At which point I say, hold on, why do you got to make 12%?
Yeah.
And so maybe there's some education related to where people ought to be in terms of that return to try to, I don't know, how do we think about that?
Yeah, it's exactly that way. We look at, it all boils down to what is the return on investment, right? And as long as we look at the project cost assumptions, the operating, is for a rental project, and the rents, right? Because those are driving the revenues. We want to make sure that the rents reflect the market. If someone comes in and says, I think I can rent this for $800, but the market's $1,000. Well, then that's a pretty big difference, and it's going to show more need. So we want to make sure we're checking all those assumptions. Once we agree that those are all sound and accurate, the bottom line is, what is that return on investment? And a lot of times what we're trying to do is only provide enough assistance to make sure that that return on investment is enough for the project to proceed, but not so much that it's sort of unduly enriching the developer. And there are thresholds that we use. I mean, we look at a couple different ways. There are a lot of large institutional investors that look at kind of their yield on cost. So they look at a project's net operating income. These are the ones that are going out to pension funds and insurance companies to get most of the money for their projects. They're looking at a yield on cost. So what's my net operating income against my total development costs? And those are commonly, anywhere between 6 and 7%. And then a lot of other developers are looking at, what's our return on equity, right? They're gonna look at the cash flow from the project and then compare that against how much equity they had to put in. And those are commonly, once we start approaching 10%, we start to say then that probably no longer needs assistance. And so that can tell us when we can turn off the TIF in some instances. So while a district might be able to run 26 years, we might be able to shut it off in 15. And the return on investment is acceptable to the developer, they proceed, but they're not getting more than they should. So we do go through that exercise to make sure that's the case. And then we try to document that, in a summary memo to make sure that, because again, as you know, there can be a lot of times criticism, right, about the use of some of these tools, and people just, well, you're giving away money. Well, no, because if we didn't give this away, this money would never be there because this project would never get built. And so going through that exercise and documenting it in kind of a summary memo, which we've done with Amy, is something that you can show the community to say, no, this is the reason why. And we can with math demonstrate that there are demonstrated needs here. So that's a good question. And I've got some examples that kind of talk a little bit about that. This first one is one that was done in Fergus Falls and River Oaks Landing. I understand, I think we have the developer here, is that right? Yeah, okay, Amy pointed you out, so nice to meet you in person. We worked on this, and I worked on it from Roseville, and Amy worked on it from up here, and we never got a chance to meet, I think, other than by phone or by email, but this was a project that I think the city was really interested in getting built. It was a greenfield site, so there was nothing there. There were a 24-unit market rate housing for 55 plus. It was at the time, this is again getting a little old, but it's 6 years ago. Costs and rents have increased, I think, dramatically since then. But this was just over $4 million project cost.
The next slide, Jason, you're not.
Oh, I'm looking at it on mine. You guys don't get to see it. There it is. I got two here. So here it is. So this was the rendering. Again, everything that I just said it was a good project, but it wasn't penciling out, right? So just to your point, is we went through that pro forma analysis exercise, and we looked at it and said, well, here, kind of on the first column there, this was at year 3. Here's what the rents were going to look like. We take out the operating expenses. We look at how much debt service. We look at there's the income at the end of the day, and then we look at how much return on equity, to the developer is going to be there. Well, 3.8%. Well, are you going to put, $1 million of equity up in a risky venture to earn 3.8% on your return? You're probably not going to do that, right? There are safer investments that are going to provide you that level of return. So the returns were below market. When we went back and looked, and we got in, so it wasn't out until all the way out to year 10 where you started to see something get towards 8.4%, which is still below that 10% threshold that I had talked about. So we go through that analysis that I mentioned, right? We went through the whole thing. We talked about it. There were rent projections that at the time in 2016, I think were fairly aggressive for what was in the marketplace. So we weren't concerned that there was an underrepresentation of what the income from the project could end up being. We looked at the development costs, operating expenses, all of those things were within reason, and we still had below market returns. So now we're trying to go through the exercise to solve for how do we get money into the project that is going to be enough to get returns to a point where we can actually get this thing built. And we looked at tax increment and we looked at tax abatement as the two options here. Could look at any other source of money, and when I show you the numbers, you could plug them in, those same numbers of dollars in from some other source and get the same result. But in this case, we had to work with was TIF and abatement. And you remember I talked about for rental housing, we had the income restrictions for the housing tax increment districts. And the goal for this project was not necessarily to build affordable housing, but it was to build market rate housing. And so we kind of eliminated the tax increment notion from the discussion early on and decided let's look at abatement because that one isn't going to carry with those restrictions with it.
Yeah, and really the policy decision from the city's perspective at that time was how do we open up other housing that the folks who would be moving into this project would then open up for new home buyers within the city. So that was a different way to approach it, and that is what happened. I mean, we do know from folks who are now living in there that they opened up other single family homes that then created a churn in the market, provided that opportunity for movement and entry into an ownership product for a new family.
And so on that one, the left side is the one I showed you previously with the 3.8 and 8.4. The circle there, the 18,065 was the amount of annual abatement, right? That was what would come back to the project through an abatement annually. And by doing that, it changes the numbers, right? You get to a 5.5 return to start out, which, you know, isn't great, and most people don't want to see that as a starting point, but, you know, he was willing to accept that, and then getting eventually to over that 10%, you know, by year 10. And obviously we all hope, and I suspect that the project performed better than we probably showed here, but the point is that the abatement, plugging that in, is what pushed this over the hump to get it constructed. So this is just a summary here. The you know, the project got built. There was the city wanted a trail to go in with this, and so this, you know, this is kind of getting creative with how to use this. Instead of a 10-year abatement, it was extended to 15, and the developer built and put in the trail for the city in exchange for more tax abatement, so the city didn't have to front those dollars, and got a project done that they wanted to get done. So that happened. So the pay-as-you-go was $175,000 total, which would be paid off over a 15-year period of time. And the project is constructed there, and as I understand it, pretty fully occupied. Is that right? Yeah. So it turned out a great project, and just did all the things that you'd want it to do if you're going to deploy some of these resources in the community.
We have about 5 minutes.
I know, I'm going to ride. I know, I saw that. I'm going to run.
Lunch is next.
Yeah, I know. Okay, so I'll go quick through these. This was Thief River Falls. They're experiencing many of the same things that you are in this county, right? Employer growth, lack of housing, companies looking elsewhere to expand because they're worried about being able to find workers to do the jobs, same kind of stuff, right? So what did they do is they were a little more aggressive to try and do some things kind of like the county's doing here, but they went ahead and bought, you know, 68 acres of land, put a lot of other local resources together, you know, looked and leveraging other state resources, got really aggressive with trying to get housing built in the community. They went through and got, you know, a lot of projects done as a result of that, right? So they were able to get a 24-unit rental project, new residential tax abatement for, you know, 26 new homes, and that was at the time. That's increased now. A residential abatement, again, kind of like the county here, and leverage all those other Minnesota housing resources for home buyers directly to be able to put more housing and get more housing built in the community. Real quickly here, another one. This was Long Prairie. This was a 37-unit rental project. You know, traditional financing wasn't enough to get this thing built. They had to layer in a whole bunch of other resources, and the return on investment even after all of that was relatively low. So just real quickly what that one looks like. You can see all the sources that were necessary here to get that project built, and I highlighted the first mortgage. You know, that's a function of how much, you know, a lot of factors, but the bank's only going to lend, you know, based on how they view the economic performance of the project's going to look, right? And so in this case, only about 47% of the project was able to be paid for with first mortgage proceeds. You generally see that more like 80%, right? So that just gives you an indication of now we've got this huge gap to solve, right? And so, you know, in this case, Minnesota Housing Grant for workforce housing was a huge piece. It was almost 18% of the development costs. Probably wouldn't have got done without that. And then the city had to participate, developer cash, there was an energy rebate for a small amount in there. And in this case, the employer, local employer, actually contributed equity to the project to get it built as well. And that's the bottom line there. Another one, Trails Edge and Cloquet. This was a rental duplex project, kind of similar circumstances. Again, couldn't support rents. Rents weren't high enough to support new construction. So again, this layered in first mortgage. There was a TIF pay-as-you-go mortgage in this case, kind of like I talked about, and developer equity. Those things together were enough to at least get the first phase done, which was 10 units with a $312,000 pay-as-you-go note. So again, just kind of different ways that cities have managed this, but again, stacking up all those resources so that they can get a project gap filled. So I'm going to stop, then we have lunch, but if there's any questions, certainly happy to answer them. Or